Welcome to Ground Truth, the podcast from Control Risks. This is the place to hear the best insights on how we're helping organizations across the world with strategic intelligence and security. I'm your host, Casper Layton. As we're recording, the US is reimposing its blockade of Iran. Missiles and drones are hitting targets on land and at sea. After a brief period of cautious optimism and an uptick in traffic, the number of ships passing the Strait of Hormuz has shrunk back to a negligible trickle. Negotiations continue, but increasingly it seems like the two sides are talking about different things. The document signed on June 17th is looking more and more like a memorandum of misunderstanding. To make sense of it, I'm joined by three colleagues who have been helping our clients navigate the conflict since its beginning. Sorana Parvulescu is Control Risk's Global Head of Geopolitical and Country Risk, and she joins us from Dubai. With me in the studio is Arran Kennedy. He's in our Maritime Risk team and based in London. And joining us from New York, we have Barnaby Fletcher. Barnaby is a principal in our Geopolitical and Country Risk practice, covering all things American. Sorana, if I could turn to you first, what was in the Memorandum of Understanding and crucially what was not in it that means we're in the situation we find ourselves in today?
So the memorandum was an initial deal, if you want, to build some trust, which was centered around really opening the Hormuz, finding a gradual way to open the Hormuz in exchange for some effectively monetary gain for Iran. And there were two aspects. One was unfreezing Iranian assets, and the second was lifting sanctions on Iranian oil specifically. And by following those steps, you would get to a gradual opening of the Hormuz, and there are a few details in there around how that would work. And that would have been a sort of confidence-building measure, if you want, that would have unlocked kind of discussing everything else, all the other issues that weren't put on the table around Iran's nuclear capabilities, around its proxies around the region, and on intercontinental ballistic missiles. So those were pushed out to kind of get over this first hurdle. But as we know, we're still at the hurdle.
And so what's Iran's negotiating position? Because unlikely as it seems, negotiations do continue amidst all this exchange of fire.
Yes, it's a nuance. The MOU is very vague in some of the terms, and I think Iranians are interpreting it quite literally vis-a-vis them controlling the Hormuz. So the big debate has been how much will they open the Hormuz, and the US will lift the blockade to allow for the next steps to happen. And essentially what's happening is US is trying to allow more ships sailing through the Hormuz than Iran is prepared to let go through before it can see that the US is meeting its other obligations.
So Barney, I'm crossing to you now. The US has imposed a blockade of Iran again. Where does that fit into the grand plan, if there is indeed a grand plan?
I think that's a good question about whether there is a grand plan. I don't think it's controversial to say that the US position has been and remains erratic. President Donald Trump has famously declared an end to this conflict no less than 38 times. There is an element of strategy here. There's no serious question that Trump doesn't view unpredictability as a negotiating tool, but there's also the fact that the formal decision-making, policy-making structures of the federal government have been weakened under the Trump administration. But what it means, the undermining of that means that major policy decisions are made by Trump after discussion with a relatively small group in the Oval Office. So for the Iran conflict, this would include Rubio, Hegseth, Vance, Kaine, Ratcliffe, Witkoff, maybe a few others. We see these changes in policy happen very, very quickly, going from commitment to negotiations to the reintroduction of the blockade, two strikes, etc. What we have is a conflict that was entered into by the US without clear strategic objectives, with conflicting views within the cabinet. Vance and Wiles, for example, clearly more worried about the domestic impacts, Hegseth more hawkish, and clear vacillation between wanting to be rid of this whole thing for it to come to an end and not wanting to be seen as losing. And to be clear, for the US, leaving Iran in clear control of the Strait would be seen as losing.
So we've got vacillation in the United States and perhaps in Iran, a much more laser-like focused on keeping control of the Strait of Hormuz, almost that's a decades-old posture that they've rehearsed and practiced, and we're seeing that play out now. Arran, as far as what's happening in the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, what are ships and our clients they're experiencing right now?
So for all intents and purposes, the situation now is the same as it was in the very early days of this conflict, which is Iran attacking ships with high impact weaponry that has a real risk of causing total loss of the ship itself and also crew casualties on board. And now the work we were doing in the early days and weeks of this conflict, so whether that be advising underwriters so they can calibrate their policies, whether that was assisting salvage companies looking to go to the aid of stricken ships, whether that were vessel operators looking where to position their trapped ships in the Gulf for relative security, or whether that was charterers of ships looking to understand how the situation in the Strait might evolve in the coming weeks and months. All of that work we were doing then, we're still doing now, but there have been a few developments since then. So for really kind of 2 or so months, Iran had virtually complete control of the strait. Iran mined the typical shipping lanes used by ships in and out of the Gulf, but it established its own shipping lane further north, and ships that received Iran's permission and in some cases paid a toll to transit were able to pass. Now, over time, the US developed a degree of a protection system over waters south of the shipping lanes, and that allowed a trickle and then more of a flow, particularly after the MOU, of ships to leave the Gulf. But what we've seen is, as that traffic has picked up, Iran has once again used this asymmetric naval system that it's developed, missiles, drones, fast attack craft, explosives-laden drone boats, to keep a lid on that, if you like, non-Iran administered traffic.
And Sorana, how's this affecting the other countries in the Gulf? How are they responding to the effective disintegration of the ceasefire?
I mean, the Gulf countries in general have been at the receiving end of this crisis in the sense that they're not active players in it. In many respects, they're almost risk takers in this situation. And of course, some have suffered more than others, with Saudi, UAE, Oman sort of having the alternative ways of allowing some exports, although they've taken some of the hits from Iran, whereas you have Kuwait, Bahrain really trapped by their geography, and then Qatar, of course, and Iraq as well. So slightly two halves there in terms of how they're experiencing this, but for all of them, they're in a really difficult predicament, because they're trying to, on one hand, influence the US to make sure that the conflict doesn't expand or doesn't re-escalate to the point that it threatens life in the Gulf and the wider economy of these countries. But equally, at the other end, they cannot accept a Hormuz that is controlled by Iran, simply because, like it does now, it would have control over their exports to markets. So it's a very difficult position in which they're in. They're also trying to seek their own negotiations pathways with Iran, understanding that ultimately the US may come and go, but ultimately they will be left here in the region with a neighbor that they have to interact with. But it's a very difficult dance when you have really sort of US and Iran talking or sort of more threatening each other than talking to each other. And they're sort of in the background and trying to manage this situation.
Barney, you mentioned the decision-making process as such in Washington, but how's this playing out amongst the American voting public? Because, of course, we can't forget that in November, the midterms are coming along. Is this conflict causing political pain in America?
So all the polling shows that the Iran conflict is unpopular and that the impact of the Iran conflict is unpopular. I separate those two out because actually what the polling does show is that inflation is more unpopular than the Iran conflict, especially among Republicans, even though both are unpopular and the inflation is obviously impacted by the Iran conflict. Unpopularity is obviously an issue. As you say, the midterm elections are coming up in November. Republicans face a very difficult task in retaining the House of Representatives. They are defending a very slim majority. And in the past 100 years, the president's party has only made gains in the House of Representatives in three elections, three midterm elections. Polls actually are suggesting that the Senate may also be in play, despite being a very unfavorable map for Democrats this year, which is, again, testament to the unpopularity of the Iran conflict, but also some of the other the actions that the Trump administration has taken and the wider economic picture. There is some speculation about how much Trump actually cares about this, how much he actually cares about the midterms. We think he does, though, and there are certainly some in his administration, such as Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, who do really care. But even before we get to the midterms, you're asking about the kind of political pain, and if we look at that more broadly, Trump has to contend with growing Republican divisions. His administration has now lost War Power Resolution Act votes in both the House and the Senate. These are votes that essentially seek to limit executive authority to conduct military action without congressional authorization. And both of these votes, one in the House, one in the Senate, passed with the support of Republican lawmakers who are either choosing to retire at the end of their terms or were primaried, defeated in primary elections earlier this year by Trump-endorsed candidates. In other words, they don't have that much to lose because their careers are coming to an end. Now, these votes don't actually mean anything. Congress has never successfully invoked the War Powers Act to stop the executive conducting military actions. They don't have anywhere near enough votes and won't have anywhere near enough votes to override a presidential veto, but they are embarrassing. They are exacerbating these divisions within the Republican Party. They are calling into question Trump's previously unassailable control of the Republican Party. And there is also the possibility, as we move forward, if there is no end in sight to this conflict, of Congress using other pieces of legislation, including appropriation bills and other spending bills, to exert pressure on the executive to end or in some way restrain actions in Iran.
So where does the solution to this situation come from, Sorana?
That's $1 million question, isn't it? I'm sure many capitals around the world would not have the answer to that. The reality is we are in a position where there's no good outcome. It's more of what the trade-off is and where can you see the parties meet. So the most realistic scenario in our view is that we drag the situation out. And it's hard to say if it's the good one or the bad one, but the alternatives aren't pretty either. So effectively you have a scenario in which this situation drags on, where you have occasional escalations. As soon as traffic picks up a bit through the Hormuz, you kind of come back to these escalations where Iran is trying to pare back traffic. U.S. responds, and then we have a tit-for-tat cycle for a few days, and then there's some talks to kind of de-escalate a bit, and then we go around the full circle again. So there's probably the most likely scenario at this point in time, just because it is very hard to see how the alternatives would work out. So of course, one alternative is that you have a significant escalation and you go back to military, sort of a larger military campaign. The U.S. sort of expands its targeting pattern. The Iran responds in kind across the Gulf, maybe to Israel as well, and we're kind of back to where we were maybe in February, March. But the reality is both sides now know, and particularly the U.S., but apart from the political constraints that Barney was talking about, but also you have there's the military option is not going to resolve the situation. So it will just sort of prolong. We now know how far the U.S. military strikes can go in terms of reducing Iran's capability. We assume they're also rearming. And also we know that the Gulf countries are lobbying quite hard to make sure that this does not happen again because of they are the ones who absorb most of the pain from it. And then the third option is some sort of deal or agreement. And this is where it's really hard to get to because, and as we've seen in the last cycle of escalation, if anything, we're kind of back to square one, right?
It seems like in that kind of scenario, the one thing that might move the dial is a significant change in the American political landscape, Barney. If the midterms go as they're predicted to, could that create a situation whereby the White House is subject to a different form of pressure and has to change its position?
So it seems unlikely. Foreign affairs, military action, although constitutionally Congress has the power to declare war, realistically military action and foreign affairs have very much been in the prerogative of the executive. I mentioned before that the Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate on separate votes, have passed War Power Resolution Act votes seeking to curtail President Trump's actions in Iran. But in order to override a presidential veto, they need a 2/3 majority. And even after the midterms, that is not going to change. I expect that there may be some more pressure, but there are other factors which are probably bigger sources of pressure on the Trump administration, including energy prices, popular support, also including U.S. armaments, and the fact that stockpiles of missiles, etc., are being severely depleted. And this is raising concern within the Republican Party and among defense analysts.
Sorana, how does that look from your perspective?
So I do think that implicitly or explicitly there is a longer term strategy here, but for on both sides in some ways, or a calculation. But the question is kind of how much cost and pain each side can take to get there. So on one hand, the U.S. administration has been doing something in the background, which is try to strangle Iran as much as possible in the IRGC, whether it's through sanctions enforcement, whether it's tightening sanctions enforcement in Iraq and other neighboring countries, for example, trying to limit the influence of Iranian proxies in countries like Lebanon and Yemen. So there is a calculation that the longer you can keep this chokehold, now destroying key infrastructure for Iran that carries kind of goods from other parts of the world, it is essentially adding up to a strategy where it's trying as much as it can to strangle the IRGC financially in the hope that the pressure is building up internally and maybe eventually the regime cracks. And of course, on the other side, Iran is counting on the fact that the longer it keeps the Hormuz closed, the more pain it adds to the global economy and to the U.S. administration in particular and U.S. economy to sort of get that additional leverage. Neither seems to be getting very far right now from what we've heard. So again, it's a question of kind of who blinks first, if you want.
So Arran, if one thing is clear here, control of the Strait of Hormuz is absolutely critical to Iran's survival strategy. How does that play out in the coming months and years now?
So before this war this year, Iran was only ever likely to follow through on its long-standing threats to shut down the Strait of Hormuz if the regime was existentially threatened. But that was a potentially risky move. Why? Because there was a risk that the strategy would fail and that the far superior conventional US military forces would essentially break through that blockade attempt. Now, what Iran has done is that Iran has finally proven that it is able to not only shut down the strait with all of those tactics that I described, but then sustain that shutdown over time. And the longer term consequence of all of that is an Iran more willing in the future to weaponize the strategic control it has over the strait. Now, in the future, Iran may use that leverage less sparingly against less significant threats. Doesn't necessarily have to completely shut down the strait, but for instance, it would be able to selectively blockade its adversaries. So, for instance, a GCC state over which Iran wanted to gain some leverage, Iran could selectively blockade that state. Now, all of that's to say, countries in the region and globally will be looking at ways to diversify away from the strait. So if you're in the pipeline construction business, or if you're in the port infrastructure business, then you're going to be incredibly busy over the next few years as countries seek to wean themselves off this reliance they have over the Strait, with an Iran more willing than ever to dictate the movement of ships in and out of the Gulf.
And Sorana, how does that impact global energy security going forwards?
Yeah, well, adding to what Arran's saying, and it's not just energy. I think we're talking about oil and gas markets. We're talking about petrochems. We're talking about fertilizers. We're talking about shipping as a whole. That is sort of looking at alternatives. And probably the longer the Hormuz stay closed, we will see more essentially structural adjustments in these markets. So we will see players moving away from the Gulf to try and recreate the capacity elsewhere. And we're already seeing in our work some early interest in alternative oil and gas exploration places around the world, which maybe people hadn't looked at in a lower price environment, but now are reconsidering. The energy one is really key. And I think if we see this scenario play out long term, like we're saying we are, the real question is, are we yet to see the shock, the energy shock? Because actually now we're sort of used up some of the petroleum reserves, the gas reserves, and so on, the petrochems. So some of the releases that we've seen over the summer and since spring have reduced some of the impact of those shortages. But the reality is we still don't have those barrels traveling through the Hormuz, and they're not going to pop up in the millions of barrels a day elsewhere, because that capacity just doesn't exist, isn't online right now. So really the question is, as we move into the cold season for the Western Hemisphere, in the planting season vis-a-vis agriculture again, are we actually still yet to see some of the major economic fallout from this crisis? Because this is kind of when it's going to start to pinch much more.
And what regions of the world are most severely affected by that outlook?
Well, the transmission belts are multiple. So, of course, we've had very serious impacts early on in the crisis for the more emerging economies, so particularly Africa and Southeast Asia, partly because they're highly dependent on oil and oil product imports, and also more dependent on short-term prices. So the bigger players have long-term contracts that allow them to be more protected from some of these shocks. The smaller players have sort of triple vulnerabilities, if you want. They pay more on the spot market, so they're more affected by short-term price spikes, but also they have weaker currencies, which means they very quickly end up with problematic balance sheets, and then that affects their credit ratings and so on, which then turns into them being more indebted in the same way currency. So you have the big Asian players that are very much dependent on oil and gas from the Gulf, China, Japan, Korea, and so on. We've seen, again, a bit of question there because China's clearly moderated its imports to reduce some of the impact, but that impact is coming. And then we see impacts very much in Europe because of the compounding effect of them being on short-term gas prices on the back of the Ukraine crisis, and now being very much, UK being one of them, being very much impacted by in the spike in short-term prices on the gas market because of the Qatar's inability to export gas. And we've seen more news now from China that kind of manufacturing prices are increasing at the factory gate in China. China is the factory of the world, effectively. Everyone imports those goods. So that is a transmission channel that will end up in a few months across sort of the global economy, really, and will translate in inflationary pressures across the world, in addition to sort of shipping and energy increases.
Barney, that China dynamic sounds like something that would wash up on American shores. How much of the other stuff that Sorana's covered in terms of the rest of the world impacts in the US?
There's been a lot of talk about how the US is less impacted by Strait of Hormuz disruptions because it is a net energy exporter. And that's true, but that's also not to say that it is unaffected. The US has been exporting more oil and gas and energy due to the disruptions in Middle East supply. US crude and petroleum exports reached record levels in recent months. This has been actively encouraged by the administration. But at the same time, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has reached its lowest levels since the early 80s. The price of gas has spiked. The administration is trying to encourage more production, has been, in fact, since before this conflict, since it first came to office. But it's had limited success because shale gas producers are looking at this as a period of volatility that they don't want to ramp up production if this is going to come to an end. And there's kind of two factors that exacerbate the issue for the US specifically, despite the fact it is an energy superpower. The first is the expectations and forecasts of energy demand because of data center developments. Installed generation capacity has remained actually it's plateaued since the kind of 2010s, a bit before, and now there's forecasts for it to the need is going to massively expand because of data center developments driven by AI. And this is already causing political issues as voters see their electricity prices increase as demand increases. And the second kind of key factor that's worth noting is that gas prices, gasoline specifically, not energy broadly, but gasoline specifically, are a uniquely politically sensitive issue for US voters. And this is very simply because US voters own more vehicles, own bigger and less fuel-efficient vehicles, and drive more frequently and for longer distances than voters in any other country in the world. So the US may be partially insulated from some of these disruptions, but that's certainly not to say that they are immune, and that's certainly not to say that these are not becoming very pressing political issues for the administration.
So this crisis has been going on for long enough that it's clearly starting to make permanent feeling changes to supply chains, to the way organizations and businesses conduct their global affairs. How are we advising clients to hedge against this enduring uncertainty and to protect themselves against whatever may come down the line in the months and years ahead? Sorana.
Having spoken with clients from really around the world in the last few weeks and months, the first thing is to focus on what's relevant to them and assume this is a longer-term situation. Essentially, what the uncertainty is driving is a killer for business because they don't know what input costs to count on. It's less the spike in cost as much as it is the uncertainty about for how long they'll be high and how they will play out. So our recommendation generally is to assume, based on our analysis, that we have to expect higher costs for longer. And that is the more cautious way to do that. And the second probably is around sort of carving out what is really relevant to the business from the noise that we hear in the market. So to Barney's point earlier, we've had at least 30 calls of the war being over. We have declarations about the Hormuz being open and closed every other day. We have talks about a deal or not a deal. The MOU was seen by some clients as a deal. It wasn't. So really kind of understanding the structural issues that are driving the situation and what that really means for markets, rather than taking at face value some of the declarations that are posted out there. That is, I think, essential. And then the third one is just working through scenarios and sort of getting into the habit of testing your business strategy against scenarios for some of these big issues based on what are your main vulnerabilities, what are your main supplies, what are your main clients, and how can you protect your business long term from some of these shocks by thinking through the potential outcome.
Okay, that's about all we have time for on this edition of The Ground Truth from Control Risks. I'd like to thank our contributors, Barnaby Fletcher in New York, Sorana Parvulescu in Dubai, and with me in the studio, Arran Kennedy. And thank you all very much for listening and watching, however you consume this podcast. Do stay tuned for the next edition coming out in just under a month from now. Goodbye for now.